Then I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Art Drum from Claybanks, and he has got some really cool things to share. I have wanted to do this for 3 years, and it's finally coming to fruition. Listen, I had a TIA in March. Give me a break. Words come from...
I was born in Claybanks Township, and most of my life I lived there with my grandparents. I left home, my grandparents' home actually, when I was 16. Moved down to Minert and Whitbeck. Worked for Coral Knowles for 25 bucks a week and room and board for my senior year in high school and the summer before that. And immediately after that I went into the service. I was 17, okay? I didn't lie about my age, but my mother had to sign for me. I wanted to go in the Air Force. They wouldn't take me because I wanted to fly, and you had to be at least 19 to get in any kind of flight school at that time. And they were still doing a draft, so the draft was a potential. The GI Bill was still in effect, and I did have an interest to go to college. You know, when you're 16, what do you know, or 17. So anyway, the GI Bill sounded exciting, and I didn't have any money. My grandparents didn't have money to send me to school, and my mother didn't either. So that's where I got started. And then I started a parallel life to what we're going to talk about here tonight at camp, because I went into the airborne artillery. We had 105 howitzers. Those were about the biggest guns you could push out of the back of an airplane. And so the cartridges look similar to this. I assume this is a 90 millimeter cartridge. I don't know who brought it, but anyway, it's about like that. And in Japan, that cartridge would be worth a big jug of Akadama wine, okay? If you could smuggle it out and make the trade. So I've seen that, and in my unit we also had Quad 50 anti-aircraft battery, and I've got a picture of one similar thing in my handout. So I've heard big guns and little guns and all of that, and so I've got some experience living out in the cold wilderness with intents, so that's what those folks did. Most of the information I have tonight is from John Royalty. Tom, we called him. He passed away about 4 years ago. You should have had this meeting 5 years ago, because he knew what was going on, because he worked there from June of 1953 till I think September 1957 or something like that. It's in here. Anyway, I've heard some of the stories he's told, but not all of them, I'm sure. His wife Carol was right there. She's one of my older cousins who married Tom, okay? I think she's at least 3 months older than I am, maybe 4. 4, yeah. John served in Korea, and it's written in here, he earned a Bronze Star, charging a bunch of Chinese with hand grenades, and he also was wounded later on and got a Purple Heart for that. So he really is the one that should have given this. But Carol can probably add some stories, and I know she's got at least one in that bag there that she'll talk about when I'm done. Tanya Cabela and others have written a lot of articles, and other people. Tom has them stretched out here and got some better pictures than I have in the handout that you can look at. And I see that some people have actually put some time into this, putting together this information. My wife and I have been into genealogy for 50 some odd years, maybe longer. We've been married 62, so it may be longer. But I've got a good history of Claybanks Township, but I never paid much attention to Camp Claybanks because it's sort of modern history, okay? I was interested in something older than that. I don't know how many of you knew Paul Grover. Paul Grover was a historian. He wrote a book about Venona Township, but he was collecting information from White River, Claybanks, and Venona, and maybe some other places too. And he finally decided this is way too much, because this was before the internet. And he actually interviewed a lot of families. He just drove around and did that. And he ended up giving me his information on Claybanks, and I used that as a start to all the information I now have. Claybanks and Claybanks families. But that's aside from that. There's lots of maps, and in my handout there's some pictures. You'll notice that sometimes the pictures don't look the same. The layouts of the camp and the photographs of the camp are different. The layouts were made at different times, and some of them were made before the camp, some were made after the camp, and some of them, the camp might not have been just like any of them. The startup. Well, the startup goes clear back to I'd start at 1949. The military wanted to put a camp on Lake Huron. And the Michigan legislature says, no, we don't want a camp on Lake Huron, and they raised all sorts of stink, and the military backed off and decided they wouldn't do it. Okay, then in 1952, now the Korean War is going on. They wanted to put one across from Selfridge Field on Lake St. Clair, and the state again made a big cry over that, and that was a little different because there's a lot of boat traffic. It's very populated there, so again the military backed off. But then in the spring of '53, they came to here, and they found all this acreage with nobody living on it, out really in the boondocks, and they started the camp, and the state really didn't say anything. Of course, the Korean War was going on, and people are getting pretty nervous about what's turned into the Cold War. Okay, it's been going for a few years now, but they're getting a lot more serious about it, and I think that sort of maybe tempered them a little bit. I believe there were about 6 families, or 6 different property owners that made up the land mass that ended up at the Camp Claybanks. 400 and some odd acres. So they started out, an engineering group came up, I understand by looking at all the papers, 23 big trucks and a whole bunch of cars, and they decided to start building the camp, which means they had to clear the land because it was basically uninhabited land at that time. A lot of trees, lots of gullies, and lots of everything there. And it was very primitive. The roads, the roads were pretty bad then. When you rode the school bus, you might get stuck in the snow or in the mud, okay? And many times the bus came by and had chains on it for either the mud or the snow. And so when they came in with those 23 trucks, they probably learned quickly that the roads in Claybanks Township weren't that great. And they complain about them now, but they're wonderful compared to what they were then. There's lots of stories about that, about the roads. George Brown, who lives right next to us, up the road a little ways, talks about the county wouldn't help the Army at all with it. The Army volunteered to upgrade the road, Webster Road we're talking about now, but the county wouldn't have any part of that. They didn't want them to do it. Well, they brought in graders and so forth, and they were grading the roads because their trucks were getting stuck, and they were doing what they could to make it passable for them. Some of these guns that were eventually towed down that road, the 120s I think weighed 32 ton, and that's a lot of weight to be going down a muddy road. And mostly it was probably mud because they didn't do it in the winter. But when these people first got there in March, who knows what kind of weather they were dealing with. And they were living in tents. One thing that's not mentioned in any of these things is, how did they live there? Well, I've gone out with a battalion and camped in the wilderness, and one thing you have to have is a latrine, okay? So I'm wondering, they lived there for the whole year. What kind of latrine service did they have out there, okay? Was it just a trench with a tarp around it? In March, it's really cold sometimes. So lots of things to think about as to how it was when those people first got there. There was an engineering group, but around June, I think Tom Royalty got there in June, and that's when the unit that was actually going to run the training center started, and the engineers had most of their work done at that time. I don't know how that changeover took place, and I didn't see any of that information in anything that I read. Starting in 1954, they had a lot of the buildings up, and they were like Quonset huts. I guess they also called them Jamesway huts. You think of a Quonset as usually a metal. These were all fabric, at least as far as I can see. And so it got a little better, and by 1955, they had just about everything a soldier would need. Maybe not desire, but they had day room and things like that. In December of according to the newspapers, in December of 1953, they'd been there, 3/4 of a year or so. By that time, the community started helping them out a little bit. Chamber of Commerce got involved a little bit. The schools started giving free passes to games. The churches started inviting them to services and activities, and I understand that even later that Jack and Jill Ranch, I think it was Jack and Jill at that time, still was holding dances for them. So I think, by the time they got through the end of 55, they were pretty well settled in, and they had tents, and they probably had wooden floors in the tents and all of that, so they weren't playing in the mud so much. Because I'm sure that first year it was muddy, cold, and wet. It's always wet. Might have been buggy too. The guns they had, I didn't read anything in any of the literature I saw about 50 caliber and 40 millimeter weapons, although they said they used them in practice. Okay, I didn't see anything about that, but later on in the 1990s they found 50 caliber ammunition, so I assume they did actually use them. I don't know what kind of guns they used. They're all the same. The 50 caliber is basically the same weapon. It can be single or double or quads, like the picture of the quad 50s on the that half track, and also on a trailer mount. 40 millimeters also came in a lot of different versions, and I haven't seen any pictures of any of the weapons that were used at the camp. They again came as singles. The 40 millimeter in Korea was used as both an anti-aircraft and an anti-personnel weapon. I show a duster on a picture there, and that's basically set up to be a anti-personnel weapon, but it's the same gun, developed in Sweden and used by most of the militaries in the world. The 90 millimeters are the ones that really made the noise and got people really excited, between that and the airplanes flying around. And you can see that this is a pretty big charge that's going to come out of there, and the velocity is about the same as a 30-06. Question? Oh, okay. And that one only weighed 19,000 pounds, okay? But it had a range of 12 miles, and it could shoot up to 43,500. That was a problem, 43,500, because planes can fly higher than that, and the purpose of anti-aircraft is to shoot them down. And also, it's got a range of 12 miles, so it means you got to shoot them when they're pretty close. And if it's carrying a nuclear weapon, you better be quite a ways away from the target, because otherwise it'll just take everything. So, but anyway, the 90 millimeter was a basic anti-aircraft weapon in the Second World War and so on. The 120s were much bigger, as I said, 32 ton, 64,000 pounds for the weapon. It was generally pulled by a tank retriever, which is also a very heavy thing. And I can imagine they just ripped those roads up. But it could shoot to 60,000 feet. And that pretty well covers anything that a Russian bomber could deal with. But still, they had to be pretty close to shoot at them. The restricted area was, you know, the noise and the airplanes and all that were a problem, but the restricted area was a real hang-up with the population around here. The boaters didn't like it. They basically said they would shoot from 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, but it went clear down to the mouth of White River, clear on up to Little Point Sable, 10 miles out. That's a big hunk of area that now they don't have boats in and all day, basically. And I've even read that at times they shot at night. Because chances are, you know, these things are run by kids. I'm 82, so if you're 30, you're a kid. And that's probably about as old as people that were there, okay? And so they didn't mind if they shot down a drone or whether they shot out of the time frame, unless somebody really raised a stink. And I have the understanding that they did do some firing at night also. 1957, the state got enough people were complaining. The state passed a resolution that they couldn't shoot. They changed their time of firing from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and they also required a permit. Don't know exactly what that permit was, but I imagine they had to have a schedule as to when they were going to fire and all of that. And they had to get it approved by somebody from the state. Okay, the targets. The drone is there. Talk about it a little bit, and you also got another handout about it. And it's 430 pounds. They just flew it around up there, and I'm sure they had specific paths they were supposed to follow and probably different altitudes, and I don't know what all they did, but they wanted to give these people training in how to track and shoot at a flying object. And they were supposed to shoot behind it, okay? The object wasn't to shoot it down, but they managed to do that a few times. They also managed to, you know, lose some because they lost control of them, or they weren't watching their P's and Q's and they ended up running out of gas. Some of them went in a drink. Some of them just got lost. Some of them are maybe still out in the National Forest somewhere for all we know. But the other one that they used was a bigger target. And I like the patch that this outfit wore. But they flew B-26s, which is a light bomber used in the Second World War and on. It was used for a lot of different things other than being a light bomber. But I like that patch where it shows this duck pulling a target, and the duck looks a little frightened. And I understand that sometimes the crews were a little frightened because you got radar controlled guns, and I'm sure they were setting them aft somehow. I don't know how they actually did their tracking, but it's pretty easy to make mistakes. I was in the artillery, and I was a surveyor, and the observation post is here, the guns are here, and the target's way out there somewhere. I was surveying one day. This is peacetime. Nobody ever shot at me intentionally, okay? But we had a round land about 100 yards from me. I was between the guns and the observation post, so somebody screwed up, you know? Had the elevation wrong on the guns. So I can understand that these guys flying these B-26s, may have had similar experiences. Well, oh, that burst was only about 100 yards behind our plane, and the target's also a mile back of us. So, but, you know, I'm sure that's an appropriate thing for them. They flew out of Muskegon. I also found out that they at times flew out of Traverse City. There was the controversy that all of this raised by people, and you can read the thing about, you know, people are tourists here. They come up here and they got all this noise. Number one, they can't drive down the road anymore because they got it blocked off. They got to go around to get anywhere, and the guns are booming, the planes are roaring, and people are complaining. They're calling. Carol told me that Tom kept getting this call from this one lady, who I won't mention the name, lives south of the park. She called a lot, and Tom, in joshing, I hope, said, maybe someday one of those will land right on your porch. Or something to that effect, okay? So there were people that were really upset, and it was driving the Army crazy, because if somebody took a boat in their target area, they had to stop firing. And they had to somehow chase them out of there. So it was a problem for everybody. I talk about John Siegart's history. He wrote a short history, which I've seen a copy of it here somewhere. Anyway, this Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hilty was the commanding officer. And so part of his job was to try to smooth over the controversy. So he talked to the local governments, and he talked to the churches and whatever, trying to smooth it over. And they had some issues with not just the noise and the boats and all that, but they had issues with the personnel. I told you, these are young guys out in the boondocks. What are you going to do? Well, you go to town, you charge something, and then you get transferred and forget about the charge, and they're left holding the bag for what these soldiers bought. And I'm sure there were other issues, because these young guys probably got in other kinds of trouble, okay? And so he was trying to smooth all of this out, and he did a pretty good job. He talked the fishermen into following his rules, and they even voluntarily made put markers out so that boats would know that this is a restricted area. And when they brought in the big guns, they expanded everything. They went out to 15 miles. Yes?
How do you hold a marker down in Lake Michigan?
With an anchor. I mean, you can put a buoy down.
On a day like today?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's buoys out there. You know, when they put their nets out there, they have buoys on them, and they are anchored to the bottom, but they're fairly shallow. When you get out to 15 miles, I don't know how deep it is, but it's a lot deeper, I'm sure. Okay, but they could put buoys out there. Okay, closure. It closed in 1958. And there's reasons for it. I suppose everybody was sick of one another. The Army was sick of the locality, and the locality was sick of the Army being there, making all that noise and causing all that trouble. But the real, I told you I'm telling you how many were trained. They said 1,200 active duty soldiers and about 2,800 reservists and guardsmen during those years were trained. Okay, like 500 would come at a time, and it may have varied. There's not a lot of information about that, but they trained a lot of guardsmen and National Guard people. But the real problem is it was becoming obsolete, okay? The Nike missiles were taking over, and in 1957, most of the AA outfits were being switched over to missiles, the Nike missiles. These Nike missiles were much better at this, okay? The Nike Ajax had a 30-mile range and a speed of Mach 2 and could go, you know, and the bigger ones could go to Mach 3. So they're introduced and they're in service. There's no reason for these guns anymore because, number one, they weren't nearly as effective. And it's really hard to hit something at 50,000 feet with a ballistic missile. You need something that can actually find it and go to it by radar, by whatever, okay? Also, the Air Force is developing the Beaumark. And it's funny because the Beaumark was developed by the Air Force and the Nike was developed by the Army, and they both wanted that job. And they fought politically, fought in Congress, they fought in the news, because both of them wanted to have the honor of being the AA missile outfit, okay? It turned out they both remained active in this. The Beaumark was a bigger missile, and it had a 400-mile range. Now we're talking about, you know, if they're headed for Washington, we can shoot them down over Canada somewhere, okay? Depending where the missile is located, probably in Canada, we can shoot them down over the North Pole or wherever, all right? Because we were primarily concerned about Russia at that time. It's funny because after I got out of the service, I got a degree in aeronautical engineering. I started working for Boeing. This was in the spring of 1961. And I was working on the Minuteman missile program, which is an ICBM solid propellant missile. The only ICBMs they had before that were all liquid propellant, and that's a job keeping those active, because all those liquids are toxic and corrosive and all of that. So the Minuteman missile was an important missile that's going to fit into the Cold War scheme of things. But because of the Nikes and the Beaumarks, the bombers that we expected to come and bomb us were no longer going to be flying at high altitude. Maybe they might fly right on the deck. They had terrain avoidance radar, so you could follow the terrain even in pretty bad weather and fly really low below the radar pretty much. Even if you knew where they were, the Beaumark had a problem in that it was going to be flying at Mach 2 or 3, and if it flew at low altitudes, it wanted to just disintegrate because of the control system. Couldn't handle that speed in that dense an air. It was designed to go up and then look around for something. So one of the first jobs I had at Boeing was to redo the mass properties of those control surfaces so that they could handle that kind of velocity at low altitudes, less than 10,000 feet or so. So this Cold War thing was just evolving, okay? It went from ballistic things shot up, they might explode, they might not explode, but they were ballistic and they had relatively short range, into missiles that could go up there and get them. But then ICBMs came into place, and now the bombers aren't the big deal. It's another rocket like that. So the efforts was put into things like the Minuteman missile. Okay, that explains why it was closed down. Two reasons really, but one is they were just not needed anymore. The aftermath. In 1992, some people along the lake found 50 caliber rounds and other debris, and the rumor got around that all they did is they just dug a big hole and buried the camp. Okay, well, that may have been partially true. We don't know for sure yet, because the Corps of Engineers came out and they looked at things and said, "Yep, that's 50 caliber," and they said, "Well, we'll come back and take a look at it." And then in '93 they recommended that there be some studies made. Then in '93 they issued a report, but it was classified. Okay, you've heard that before. Our local news now is that way, And anyway, but they said, well, you know, it's got to go through the chain of command and get everybody to look at it before we can make it public. And anyway, this is pretty low priority. Then in '96, they had meetings out here, and they did some more things, and they put out a document that said how things should be handled if things are found, basically. And they made areas. In this area you'd expect to find this, in this area you'd expect to find this, and if you find that, then this is what needs to be done. All right? And then in 2005, they had another public hearing, and it's just sort of gone by the wayside. Chances are there's not a lot out there. One of the things I learned in the Army at that time, I was in during that very time. I got out in '58, okay? And during that time, I had a first sergeant give us a lecture on how to conserve toilet paper. And how you could do the job with one little square. Very detailed description of how you could do that, okay? They were cheap. They were cheap at the beginning of the Korean War because they sent, in 1950, they sent those Marines over there, the Chosun Reservoir, with no Mickey Mouse boots, no winter clothing. The biggest concern for most of them was frostbite, okay? So after any kind of conflict, they let the military go to pot. And after World War II, they did that. And then Korea came along, and it was a shock to them that they didn't have the proper clothing for even those soldiers then. So I've pretty well run out of things to say, but Carol has something to say. Come on up.
My dad found a parachute in his field, and he brought it up to the house, and it laid around for a long time. Finally, I got it, cut it into strips, and made a rug out of it. And so, hold that. It is. I had a loom that you make them on. I still have the loom, but it's got to be rewarped, and so it's. And one other thing, the guys out there wanted to have a little recreation. I don't like that thing. Recreation, so they got a basketball team together. Just a lot of guys from Montague. I know there was a Cedarquist and a lot of them other guys, and the guys from the Army camp.
They need to hear you in the back.
Okay. Oh, I don't like this. And so they got this game together and played basketball at the tannery. They could use the tannery gym. And so they went down there and had a lot of fun, and so that was their recreation beside the bar.
Got a question.
The tannery was also used for the Montague schools. All their games were played there at that time.
Do you know what the parachute was from?
Yeah, the parachute was from one of those.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were 20 plus feet in diameter, and one of them must have got lost somehow.
That's how they bring it down?
Yes, they fly them up there, and there's different descriptions of how, but basically they fly them wherever they want them, and then they cut the engine and deploy the parachute, and it comes to ground. Yes, ma'am.
What was the parachute made of?
It's the parachute.
It's probably nylon.
Yeah, I had to cut it in strips.
Yes, ma'am.
The drone would be pulling a target?
No, the drone did not pull a target. They just shot behind it. Okay. The B-26s towed a big target. It was like 3 feet in diameter and 18 feet long, or something in that neighborhood. So it was a big target and very visible for a long way. Yes.
Also, how did they calculate the distance out in the lake? Which is so hard, you get this measurement. But across the lake distance is really hard.
You mean to have the round go off near the target? They had technical equipment to do that for those guns, okay? I'm not familiar with them, but that was calculated, and those charges were set to go off at a specific distance.
That's what trigonometry is that.
Yeah, a little math involved in all of that, okay? But it has to be done quickly.
Machine done.
Yep, a machine did the calculation for them, based on the radar. The radar gave them the distance out there, and then that calculated how to set the round to go off at the right place, which was just another thing that made them less effective than the missiles, because the missiles would home in on heat or radar or something, so they could actually hit it or come extremely close to it, so if when the round went off, it would damage it.
Pilots and the bombers from plane coming down, sometimes they just on that cable. And like you said, they go off too close.
Yeah. Christy?
So, how far could you hear these explosions?
Probably Rothbury.
No, we heard them down Montague.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Depends upon the weather, I assume, because we could hear them pretty clearly out on Old 99. And you could, and actually on 48th Avenue, Dick Smith told me they used to watch the drones flying out there. 48th Avenue it's only a mile and a half from the lake. Yes, Harold?
We used to deliver milk out there, and little boys would get on those drones and go around the circle, riding like couple.
Well, they were young. I did stupid things when I was young, I know that.
My husband was in Korea for 2 years and then 4 years out at Camp Claybanks, and Camp Claybanks was heaven according to Korea.
It was. He wasn't at the Chosan Reservoir, but he saw some desperate action. Okay, Chosan Reservoir problem was really basically cold, and they were outnumbered about 10 to 1. Okay. Yes, Harold.
I went to Paris, and I wrote my buddy Harold Haynes in Korea, and he says, write about you, can't write about that. Because we're lucky to have the right rare stuff.
Yes. Okay, so he wrote to somebody that was there in a bunker with a bunch of Italians that cooked food that was too hot to eat.
He used to run the recovery place out here, and he told me they scrapped out a lot of them.
Is that right?
It's a lot.
I know there was one in Hunt's Yard out there, and I know Seaver's had one hanging in their barn.
Yeah. Okay.
How many others?
So there are some around yet.
Yeah.
56, I was working at the marina down next to the yacht club. I got hired. Come up there and use the microphone?
Yeah, you want to?
I got hired on my day off. Give me a radio, and I'd sit at the lower mark. And they would knock these down every so often, and they would parachute down. My job was to free plane. I was in climbing. So all I could do was tie the thing so that it didn't keep going down. And I fall, and they send a rescue boat coming to get it from me. It's kept parachute for it. I'm still using it for that.
Parachute cord is good. That's all airborne people keep parachute cord. Yeah.
I'm still using parachute cord. I got 1956 for little braided things for knives. And got a ship's bell. It's my bell at home. This handle on the claver is parachute cord from one of those guys.
Yeah. I understand they use ducks out there.
Yeah. be the floating vehicle.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because they come running down the beach,
yeah.
you know, and then they'd come out and he had to pick it up. My job was just get a line on it so they could
To keep it from sinking.
in deep water. I was probably only in 10, 12 feet of water.
Yeah.
Because even when they'd knock it down, they'd float for a little while. And that was my job. I was just outside the, you know, they're shooting this way. I'm down there at the other end of the building by a marker that was set for me,
Okay.
you know. And I had the walkie. They gave me the walkie-talkie.
So did they pay you guys to do that?
$5
$5
per day.
per day?
And how many did you retrieve?
One. Well, they didn't knock them all down. I mean, I was in Harry's from the week after I got out of June until Labor Day. So, and shoot on Thursday. That was my days off, weather permitting. They called. Come out. Harry let me have a boat, and I would go up there and park, literally, and watching these guys, and they're shooting away at them, and every so often they'd whack one. One day they did, on my ship, and that's, like I said, I've still got some of the parachute cord I rescued from that drone to this day. It's in my home.
I heard a story about, I guess it was at one of their open houses. They had two of them. They had a first one and another first one. They had one on the 14th of May in 1954, I think was just mostly local people. And then they had one in 1955 in May also, which corresponded to Armed Forces Day. And when I was in the service, Armed Forces Day was a big deal, okay? Everybody came, and in my case, we always jumped out of airplanes and dropped guns and shot the guns and all that for the people to watch while they're on bleachers, okay? But anyway, one of the stories they heard there was that sometimes this National Guard or something, they said, well, you know, every once in a while we want to let them shoot down a Chevy, because that's about what they were worth, I guess. Those planes were worth about what a new Chevy would be worth, okay? So I think on occasion they were shot down on purpose. They had a mess hall, and they had an officer's place.
They had a recreation.
They finally had a recreation place by 1956 or something like that. That took a while to get that sort of thing, and yeah, and they probably improved their mess facilities, because I imagine it was pretty rudimentary the first year. Oh, these are this property all went back to the original property owners. There was like 6 of them. They owned pretty big parcels. And the ones on the lakeshore have been all basically converted to tourist. They don't have cottages anymore. They have big houses on them, okay? But they're all occupied. Practically all the land is occupied by residents, non-residents mostly. In World War II, our neighbor Bob Shertam buzzed our area there in I think it was a B-25 rather than a B-26, but he was right. Just skimmed the tops of the silos. That one was right at the end of the road, probably right by John Muckna's place there, close anyway, right on the end of Webster Road. And he said the plane, they found a parachute on the beach, and they pulled on the parachute, and here comes a plane. So, yes, ma'am.
Property owners, they own the property. Did the government rent that property from them, or they just
It was leased. They leased it for I don't know how long, but they all went back to the property owners. The cost to clean up the mess that they put out in the lake would be, you know, millions and millions of dollars. But I can't imagine that it's damaging anything, because if you think about how many ships have sunk in Lake Michigan with a lot worse chemicals and different metals and so forth on them, I don't think anybody's identified any harmful effects from that. But if you're a good environmentalist, you can probably come up with a reason.
You guys, look at this engine. It's a 4-cylinder, 2-cycle air-cooled McCulloch engine. Originally the factory was in Milwaukee, I think, later moved to California. It was designed for a very, very short lifetime, maybe 100 hours. Very cheap bearings. 4 cylinders, air-cooled opposed. They also made a 2-cylinder, same type engine. How many of you guys read Popular Science, Popular Mechanics when you were kids? 1, 2. Did you ever want to make a gyrocopter? Benson gyrocopter? That's the engine you wanted. Can you imagine that? 72 horsepower, 4,200 RPM. Screaming away right behind you. Excellent example, just wonderful. Thanks for bringing it. Thanks for having this show. Wonderful.
I don't see any more hands. Come and rescue me.
One good thing.
Thank you, Art, for presenting such wonderful information tonight. And thank you, Terry, for letting us be here and to see this wonderful drone. I just am fascinated by it.